director of Beyond the Built Environment, and as of January 1, the president of the National Organization of Minority Architects. And in my presidential platform, I've taken the position that we should be part of the conversation globally in terms of making and putting forefront the well-being of society, specifically when fighting racism and sexism through the built environment. So for me, the way I'm defining the well-being is not only community engagement, but also acknowledging that architecture can be designed to harm, and we have the responsibility to design it to heal as well. So to talk about how architecture specifically speaks to this, it's not just the justice, equity, and diversity inclusion priorities that are for the ways we run our offices, but it's also in the projects that we build as well. And so before I can talk about projects that heal, I'm going to first talk about projects that harm. An example is the Robert Moses Low Bridges. So he, when developing Jones Beach in New York, did not want the undesirables to attend. And undesirables were minorities and immigrants. Recognizing that our main mode of transportation was buses and mass transit, he mandated that all the overpass bridges of the highway to get to Jones Beach was 9 feet or lower. So he was able to manifest his racist ideals through the built environment with 20 bridges that still hold today. So we also think about development that has both affordable housing and a market rate housing that makes the finances of the project viable. And with that inclusion of having the affordable housing and therefore government subsidies, some developers then create a door that is for the market rate tenants and ones for the affordable housing tenants, to which I advise that that is the modern day equivalence of whites only and coloreds only entrances, where you're leveraging the socioeconomical background of the person to where the quality of life that they get, when in actuality, the whole project wouldn't have been possible without their participation in the structure in itself. There's gentrification, there's redlining, there's all sorts of ways where architecture is used to harm. And so one of the very first projects that I started on as an intern is the African Burial Ground National Monument in New York in downtown Manhattan. While they're excavating for another federal building, they came across some African remains, and through the research of Howard University, found that there was 419 remains and over 500 artifacts. But it was also understood that the African Burial Ground actually has an estimated 20,000 remains. So the federal buildings to the north, to the south, to the east, to the west, City Hall that we all get married at, all are built on the backs and the bones of our ancestors. So architecture from the very beginning, for me, had an opportunity and a responsibility to also teach, to keep history, and to make record. So on the side of the ancestral chamber, we also engraved the map of the full world, of the full area down in Manhattan, to show the extent of the burial ground so that those who visit the monument understands that component as well. This project also leveraged a series of community engagement activities in every single borough of New York to get everyone's feedback and opinions as we developed the project and the work that we were doing. The next project that I wanted to share was 888 Boylston, which is the highest performing speculative office building in all of New England. Here is where I fight for environmental justice and understanding how the built environment, specifically through the ways that we create our structures, how they can start to give back and actually do in a responsible method, whether it be from high performance glass, photovoltaics, wind turbines. We really tried to leverage as much as possible ways to create a product that is LEED Platinum, that really speaks to those ideals of environmental justice and design in the work that we're doing. The next is Bronx Point. This is a 542 affordable housing structure in the Bronx. It also has the first ever brick and mortar hip hop museum, community spaces, beautifications of an existing park, Mill Pond Park, and access to the waterfront. The concept of the entire project is hip hop because Bronx is the birthplace of this beautiful cultural phenomenon that has changed the world. It is important that with this project, we also had a series of community engagement meetings that allowed us to connect with the community so that they can see and identify themselves culturally in a way that speaks to the volumes, where they see this as a place of home and not just an affordable housing structure, but a manifestation of who they are and their authentic self. We also wanted to make sure that the idea and the concept of that culture of that local community was represented in the materials, the brick selection, the ways we had the windows dancing, are all in a ways of kind of amplifying their voices and the stories of those people. And lastly, the Cleveland Foundation headquarters. The Cleveland Foundation headquarters is a really powerful project that I wanted to speak to you all today, because the actual headquarters only needed about half of the program that they built. The other half of that programming was all focused on the community. So on the center of your screen at the bottom there, all that yellow program is actually for the community. So we had a series of community event meetings through Midtown to create and to have conversation and discourse with the local communities about what they needed in the building that would support and not be duplicative with other resources that they already have in their community. So I thought it was quite powerful to have an organization pay for and build program in space and capacity for the community to use, whether or not the foundation is working during those office hours or not. And really thinking about how that starts to have a larger gesture through that programming. And lastly, before the Cleveland Foundation even announced that they were going to move their headquarters to this predominantly Black community, they were able to connect with that community and actually have them establish a land trust and purchase all properties and significant properties for that community to ensure that once that was announced, that gentrification wasn't profitable and made the property values of all those things go up and really push them out of their own community. So it's another example of how a client themselves can be accountable to the communities that we're serving, and not only just creating spaces for it, but including the community in the process well before the typical process in which we've come to use for. I have this speech that I speak about called the I Was Asked to Stand, where when I was in school, the professor asked me to stand, me and another student, out of a classroom of 60 kids, and said that we would not become architects because we were Black and because we were women. And I share this story because when we talk about the wellness and well-being, it talks about and incites the requirements of having diversity in the profession as well, to push for these diverse agendas, to make sure that all communities are represented. And as I share this story, it might be surprising to some of you, but when I do give this speech in public spaces, I usually ask the audience to stand. And in every instance, the audience stands. So although it is a shocking and annoying thing that occurs, it is also part of the process of how the limitation of diversity is coming to. It does not just happen to me, it happens often, and it's something that we need to recognize. I tried to think about why that professor would make such a proclamation, why he thought it would be that safe. And I think about the demographics of the student applications being at or nearly 5% for over a decade. And ultimately, we have 5% enrolled, but only 3% graduate. And I question whether that 3% were also students who were also told that they also could not be architects, or if it was something that was not indicative for them. I also think about the demographics of the professors. Not to say that I can only be taught by women and people of color, but it's important that my colleagues and my peers also see women and people of color in the position of professor to speak to that, as well as the diversity of the materials that is being heralded as great architecture in that process. When one Googles the word great architects, Google banner comes up with 40 beautiful names and faces. In that, only one is a woman and 0 are African American. And that speaks, and when I went to the Google headquarters, and here's a slide of 40 amazing African American architects who've changed the world. And when I speak to Google and ask why that was the process, they shared because there's not enough content out there that actually lists us as great. Paired with that, I also listened to Dr. Adelaide Sanford's In an Afrocentric Education as a Human Rights speech, where she introduced me into a very important figure, Albert Shanker. Albert Shanker was the president of the United Federation of Teachers from 1964 to 1997, roughly. And his idea was to create equitable education for public schools across our nation. So whether you were in New York or in Kentucky, if you attended public school, your education would be the same. However, his thought process responded or pivoted on the ideas of erasure. Never let the African American child learn of his or her history, because if they do, they'll relate more to their ethnicity and will not become an American. And so plagued with that as our educational process in terms of what are the diverse faces and works that we're actually preview to, as well as the lack of kind of training on how to teach and keep history, it's all prevalent into why it starts to put this mission forward. And so what I host is a series of Say It Loud exhibitions that elevate women and BIPOC designers of a particular location, where we're able to see our faces with very large headshots next to the work, hear our voices, video testimonials of them speaking to the experience as a diverse professional, and feel our impact which is through our work, which is the way we want to be evaluated and assessed anyway. So through this exhibition, we've hosted 37 exhibitions so far, starting in January of 2017. And during one of the exhibitions, a member of the United Nations was actually present and invited us to present the Say It Loud exhibition at the United Nations campus, visitors campus in New York. And during that, I was able to leverage that opportunity to speak, to ask the world leaders to help with understanding how representation matters and help make this a national movement. Exactly 1 year later, March 25th, 2019 was Say It Loud Day. We were able to translate the exhibition into 8 languages. So that's how you say It Loud, coming down the center of your screen there. And professors and students all over the world was invited to their information centers worldwide and get to learn about the great work of women and BIPOC designers globally. We also think about ways of schools of architecture and thinking about the curriculum. And Georgia Tech was the very first school of architecture that approved having an exhibition focused on women and minorities. And they were not the first that were asked. So I say this to say heralding the stories and the work of women and BIPOC designers is not something that is easily accepted, specifically and especially in this country. We then had the Say It Loud United Kingdom. And this is when we had our first global exhibition where we're able to start to understand that this discourse and this issue is actually a global one, which is why we're so, again, proud to participate in our event today. And so really, again, leveraging the work globally was powerful and important to understand. Sorry. Then in March of 2020, we had Say It Loud Ohio, which was at the Caramoo House Theater, which is the oldest African-American theater in the country. During the beginning opening ceremony, the governor got on the screen and said, COVID is crazy, so no more gatherings of large people. And so aside from the few that joined early on, no one got to see this exhibition that elevated 44 designers of Ohio. And so we were able to pivot and create these virtual galleries and exhibitions where we're able to show the faces and the works of people of that community. And when you select one of the thumbnails, you get the profile that you see on the right-hand side. Now, this was important and powerful because we also see a neglect of our stories. As Google said, listing us is great. And so this became part of the mission that we were able to move forward during the pandemic. Say It Louder Ohio